Thanks for joining us on the program. Today, I am Amarachi Ubani. President Muhammadu Buhari is back from the first ever Russia-Africa summit in Sochi, during which he held a bilat with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Both leaders agreed to work together towards developing Nigeria's oil and gas industry. Russia would explore Nigeria's oil in the deep offshore. Both would solidify the venture between NNPC and Russia's gas plant Gazprom. Also, Russia has offered to help revive Nigeria's Ajaokuta Steel Company, as well as the protracted aluminum smelter company of Nigeria in Ikotabasi. Russia would also help develop Nigeria's rail infrastructure by constructing a 1,400-kilometer rail line from Lagos to Calabar, Cross River State, plus the construction of a nuclear power plant in Nigeria. Finally, there were agreements in education and agriculture, security and military cooperation, in which the Nigeria-Russia military technical agreement will be renewed to foster direct procurement of military hardware on a government-to-government basis at lower cost. President Buhari also left Sochi with assurances from Russia of working with Nigeria and other African countries to secure and stop the piracy in the Gulf of Guinea and Russia's cooperation in the fight against the Boko Haram and ISIS. Speaking of terrorists, we'll be talking a bit about them in a minute when we look into the impact of Turkey's incursion in northeast Syria following the U.S. announcement of a pullout. So far, the United States and Russia have struck deals with Turkey for a period of ceasefire to allow civilians to leave the area. And let's remember, the reason Turkey is in the area is because it considers the Kurds, which initially had the backing of the United States, as terrorists. And it says it wants to create a safe zone in Syria. Other stakeholders have a few thoughts about that.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan issuing more threats against Kurdish fighters in northeast Syria. It says Turkey will use its right to crush Kurdish militia fighters if they have not withdrawn from a safe zone, as by a truce between the United States. On Thursday last week, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces accused Turkey of launching an offensive targeting 3 villages in northeast Syria. But Russia, which also struck a peace deal with Turkey, says everything is going ahead smoothly. And as the Kurdish fighters pull back, Turkish-backed rebels continue to advance into areas left by the fighters, which they say will later be used as safe zones for Syrian refugees. The Syrian Kurdish militants withdrew from Tel Abyad under a truce brokered by U.S. Vice President Mike Pence 2 weeks ago. The deal was limited to the central part of the border strip between the Syrian towns of Tel Abyad and Ras Alin, where Turkish forces had focused their military offensive. Turkey sealed another deal with Russia, under which Syria and Russian forces are deploying in northeast Syria to remove Kurdish YPG fighters and their weapons from the border with Turkey. Turkey later said it will ask the United States to extradite the commander of the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces in compliance with the bilateral extradition treaty between the two countries. President Erdogan views the SDF commander General Abzlum Kubani as a terrorist closely linked to the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, which has waged a decades-long insurgency in Turkey. After Republican and Democratic U.S. senators urged the State Department on Wednesday to quickly provide a visa to Kobani, Turkey condemned the United States for treating the commander as a legitimate political figure. Meanwhile, NATO defense ministers gathered to discuss a German protocol for a security zone in northern Syria that received support from Turkey and the United States. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg indicated that the German protocol could feature United Nations supervision and require further discussion. The U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper met his Turkish counterpart on the sidelines of the NATO meeting. The U.S. deems the Turkish incursion as unwarranted. While leaders discuss, the Syrians themselves are left to deal with the crisis by fleeing. The UN says more than 176,000 have fled their homes since the Turkish assault.
U.S. President Donald Trump's America First policy may have created more problems in the Middle East as its decision, which it now regrets, which is to withdraw troops from northeast Syria, made way for Turkey to unleash its offensive against Kurdish militants, which it believes are in cahoots with the Islamic State militants, to which terrorist groups in Sub-Saharan Africa have affiliations. The fight against the Islamic State in Syria saw the spread of these terrorists to other parts as they fled fighting up there. Turkey just wants to protect its borders against these terrorists, it says, and it believes it is not only exercising a Turkey-first policy, but doing the world a favor. I want to bring in Professor of African History, Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Ibadan, Mr. Isaac Olawale Albert, who joins us from our studio in Abuja. Professor Albert, thank you for joining us on Diplomatic Channel.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Who benefits the most from the Turkish offensive in northeast Syria, seeing that the aim, according to Turkey, is to create a safe zone in the area?
Well, of course, Turkey is the main gainer from that process, in the sense that as a result of the military offensive, Turkey has gained close to 100 kilometers of areas hitherto held by Kurdish militia. But to me, I want to regard it as a very complex situation. What Turkey has done is like an anaconda, a very big snake, hitting a lion. And so there are several matters arising. Turkey has gained new territories. Turkey has succeeded in suppressing one of its arch enemies, but the international community is now alleging crimes against humanity, in the sense that a number of Kurd militias have been arrested, harshly dealt with. Some of the detainees, Kurdish detainees, are being maltreated, and the international community is complaining. Just this afternoon, some Australian Kurdish are actually calling on the international community to step into the present situation in that axis.
Yeah, and I do understand the part where you say other countries are quite wary of what's going on with Turkey in northeast Syria. These European countries and the United States are busy running around, brokering deals with Turkey in a bid to help curb military action in northeast Syria. They've succeeded in agreeing with Turkey to limit its actions to the border. But why is Turkey's action not a win-win? Seeing that, Turkey, of course, just like all these other countries, also wants to see the end of the Islamic State in the Middle East.
Turkey is trying to protect its national interest. America is trying to protect its national interest. So there are several conflicting situations in that situation. For now, the narrative, or what Turkey is saying, is that it's trying to protect its borders. But one could clearly see the objective of that intervention, that what Turkey is basically trying to do is to suppress the Turkish militias. And Turkey has been having problems with the Kurds since 1978. I mean, it is, the Kurds have been actually trying to exit, from Turkey. And there is the Turkish nationalism that is actually offending the national security of Turkey. So what Turkey is trying to do now is to come up with what one would regard as the final solution to actually deal with the Kurds once and for all. But it is a very complex situation because it affects several other interests.
At the onset of this Turkish incursion, relatives of Kurdish fighters held in prisons, prisons guarded by the Kurds, all of them escaped, most of them escaped, and these Kurdish fighters could not, guard those prisons because they were busy defending themselves and their families against the Turkish forces. Now, these Kurds from who Turkey regards as terrorists, they're working with Islamic State militants. America, of course, thinks otherwise. But should that put countries in Sub-Saharan Africa on red alert? The fact that, there is a renewed crisis in the Middle East, especially in Syria, particularly, shouldn't there be some concern for Sub-Saharan African countries about the possible increase of the intensity of terrorism, seeing that groups like Boko Haram have affiliations with the Islamic State?
Well, I think Sub-Saharan states are increasingly facing very complex security challenges. Unfortunately, African states are not actually doing enough to address this problem. What seems to be happening now is that the rest of the world is increasingly sweeping troublemakers to Africa. And therefore, you are going to have different types of proxy wars in Africa. Now, for us in Nigeria, let me address Nigeria. We have two problems. And the two problems I will characterize as two axes of evil. We have problems coming to us from the Sahel. Sahel now is becoming like the headquarters of troublemakers in the world. All the terrorist organizations in the world have their franchise, they have their headquarters in the Sahel. And by Sahel, I mean that narrow strip from Mauritania to Djibouti. Now, you have different groups there, terrorist organizations, transnational border criminals, engaging in career criminality and situational criminality. You have human traffickers. All of them are in the Sahel. Now from the Sahel, they push problems southwards. So they push problems to us here in Nigeria. They push problems to the other countries like Burkina Faso and so on. The point I'm trying to make is that whereas other African countries will bear part of the shock, Nigeria will bear more of the shocks because we have the capacity to handle the pressures coming from the Sahel, coming from the Gulf of Guinea. And if IC is given more problems in the Middle East, of course, they will come to Africa to fight proxy war. Yeah. By proxy war is to say that these people, if they are not able to fight their primary enemies in the Middle East, they will come to fight their interest in Africa. And that is why our security in Nigeria, in Burkina Faso, in Mali, to me, is in a very, very serious problem.
Professor, America is already retracing its steps, as it concerns troop withdrawal in northeast Syria. Defense Secretary Mark Esper has been in Afghanistan to possibly revive peace talks. We also saw House Speaker Nancy Pelosi meeting leaders there last week. Esper also held talks with his Turkish counterparts on the sides of the NATO summit, which held over the weekend. It's clear America's presence and absence will impact greatly on the region as troops from Syria are redeployed to Iraq. But the president says America has been involved in a war it did not start. So would it be a good strategy then to renegotiate America's influence in the Middle East?
I think what America is trying to do is to scale down the use of force and now move in the direction of non-coercive approaches. America has, indicated interest in negotiation. America has indicated interest in strategic withdrawal, withdrawing from Syria now to Iraq to say, okay, we are going to position our troops in Iraq while we are negotiating where negotiation is possible. I mean, to me, this is a scientific approach to conflict management. It is not our own kind of situation where you are locked permanently into the use of force. I mean, strategic assessment of interventions requires that the intervener should know when to continue with the use of force and when to scale down the use of force. Unfortunately, Iraq is not ready to allow American troops to remain on its soil for too long. So to Iraq, the American troops will only stay in Iraq for a short period. But I'm sure that diplomacy would actually have its way at the end of it. Negotiations are going on, but the outcome of that intervention, I think, will unfold in the weeks to come.
I truly believe that too, Professor. But if Nigeria were to pick a leaf from Turkey, which says it is compelled to take its destiny to its own hands to protect its borders against terrorists, Nigeria has established to some extent that there are external forces helping the Boko Haram. Can we also do the same?
Well, we need to do the same. We are already doing it. Whether we are doing it well, I think, is the question. There is the need for us to respond to the first axis of evil that I identified, the Sahel. I mean, troubles are coming into Nigeria from the Sahel to Nigeria. And how well are we responding to the situation? I don't know. Problems are also coming from the Gulf of Guinea. And then our borders, most especially the southwestern borders of Nigeria, permit arms to come into Nigeria. The government is dealing with it, but I am a little bit not too comfortable with this issue of closure of border. For how long are you going to close the border? So what I would expect Nigeria to do is to rejig its border management strategies, make those who are managing our borders to become more accountable, and then we begin to see results. I don't actually know what the government saw before coming to that policy, and I don't know whether the gains from it are as strong as what we're losing from it. But I want to conclude here that it is not a sustainable strategy.
Thank you so much, Professor Olawale Albert. I really appreciate your thoughts, your analysis on these issues.
Thank you so much, Amarachi, for inviting me.
And we'll be right back on Diplomatic Channel.